Hello, everybody. Matt Desch here, CEO of Iridium, and I'm here with a special guest today, Chris Quilty of Quilty Analytics. Hello, Chris.
Hey, Matt.
Just show everybody you can speak. Anyway, we're going to make this a very casual event here, and we're celebrating really the 12th anniversary of Iridium going public on the NASDAQ, and really, Chris and I started working on this. I've been with Iridium 15 years at this point. I thought maybe we could just talk a little bit about that process. This will be something for the Iridium Museum, along with all the other memories that we've had over some 30 years of being around. But it's certainly been an interesting ride. And Chris was part of that, actually, as an analyst, I guess, would be probably had a more glorious title than the industry mogul you are today, but you were at Raymond James, who was helping us go public, right?
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, and so we met, we probably met very early on when I joined because you were writing the definitive work on the satellite and space industry at the time for that bank, that investment bank, and I was trying to figure out how are we going to get enough money to build this brand new Iridium Next system. And how do I transition from being a private company over 8 to 10 years to a public company, and what would that process be? Do you remember at all the first time you started to see Iridium and wondering what we had and what we could become?
Yeah, well, I think the proper answer for most people is they read the Harvard case study on the Iridium bankruptcy, which I actually did not. And for the early years when I was with Raymond James, I was actually a small cap defense analyst. And certainly post 9/11, by the mid 2000s, just about every single small cap defense company had been acquired. And hence I had no purpose for existence. And so I started to look around at what was interesting. And around that time, 2005 through 7, you had a bunch of the space companies that had gone bankrupt in the 90s and early 2000s were coming back public once again. And so it looked interesting enough. I couldn't quite claim that I would see where we are today with the industry or where Iridium would be today. But I wrote a big, you mentioned it was like a 220-page tome on the industry and initiated coverage on a bunch of companies. You and I called you up out of the blue, probably when I was writing that report, and we conferred and you helped me on a bunch of stuff, and we stayed close. I think I probably spoke at some of your early partners conferences. After you went public, you banned me for a decade. I think during that process.
No, what can I say? You were, But.
Yeah, but I think I got to know the Iridium story, and you kind of set me straight on the early OpenPort project, which I don't think was anywhere on my roadmap. And so we got to know each other pretty well, and apparently you got comfortable enough with us, the team at Raymond James, to go out and hire us to do this impossible project of bringing Iridium public in the middle of a financial crisis. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, we got to talk about that a little bit, but I remember starting the process of saying, how was I going to get this project funded? We were actually profitable and growing and had a track record of 6, 7, 8 years as we were starting to talk about this. So we had something to build on, but we had a bit of risk ahead of us as well, like a $3 billion program built on satellites that we still didn't have necessarily, we had a contract for. I mean, we were just coming up on a contract for, so we had an idea what it was. And we had selected a new rocket that never had been launched yet, which maybe was a risk factor that some might have seen. But on top of all that, we were saying, I thought that perhaps we'd either have a public offering or maybe we would raise some private equity and go public at some point or another. But something happened around the 2008 timeframe, I think. That was exactly when I had talked to all these private equity firms and thought there was some interest, but then just as we were going to down select, I think Lehman Brothers went under. I think that started some little process of a housing bubble at the time. And the markets weren't very hospitable for companies like us at that time, were they?
No, they were not.
They were really focused on maybe more secure business models at that time, like banks and things like that. And even they were kind of very concerned about. So, having a satellite company, particularly in the environment we had been in with what I think you sometimes call Space 2.0, and others have sort of called that world that was back in the 90s that we were part of. And it didn't go so well back then. So, the concern about where we might be, there was a little bit of a hangover. I remember these guys. I read a Harvard business case on them or something else, but I didn't really remember where they were. But we decided to go forward with the process because, frankly, we had a really solid business, right? Everything else looked really good. We had cash flow, we had revenues, we had a solid growth record of operational EBITDA and profit. Our cash was growing. We just didn't have quite enough of it. So going into the public markets was a way to do it. But there was something I heard called the SPAC. Everyone seems to know it today, but frankly, I think in those days, I had said who else had gone public via SPAC, and the only one I recognized was Jamba Juice, which I didn't think we were a lot like, right? And you hadn't really done a SPAC in those days, right? I don't think, or had you? I don't think many.
In fact, they do not have a section in your MBA course on SPACs. At least they didn't back in the late 90s when I went to business school. And it took us took me a while to educate myself on the mechanics of the SPAC transaction. And quite honestly, as we looked at the different options we had, remembering back then, watching Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and everybody collapse and the markets going to hell in a handbasket, it felt like it was going to be years before there would be another IPO. And, Iridium, of course, didn't have the luxury of waiting 2 years for the IPO market to come back. You had a time certain limit on the life of the constellation, which actually turned out to be a lot better than I think we ever anticipated, thank goodness. But we had to find a path forward. We needed to raise capital, at least the initial slug of capital, to get things moving. And, I think probably if we had waited another 6 months or so, the markets did come back enough that, the IPO window opened again. But, who knew at the time? Just like today with COVID, who would have ever thought the markets snapped back as quickly as they did? But, the guys at Greenhill were a great team to work with. And it was an interesting process, to say the least.
Yeah, and we should compare it really to the SPAC process of today. It was a little different. The rules were a little different there. They weren't really set up as easily for success, I believe. For those who don't know about SPACs, a financial entity, it could be a hedge fund, could be an investment bank, could be anybody really, goes out there and creates a vehicle and really IPOs it without any kind of business, but then has sort of a clock via the schedule to find someone else to merge with and get their shareholders who invested in that to vote, enough of them to vote yes, and not too many of them to vote no, and many other things that are sort of in between. And what the process wasn't brand new then. There had been these blank check companies before, but it was sort of something that was emerging during this downturn in the market that was becoming popular because there was no other way to go. And as you said, our satellites had a clock ticking on them. We didn't know how long it would be. Frankly, thanks to my great operations team, they were able to stay going for over 20 years. But at that time, we were hoping for at least 15 and maybe longer. So, but the process really, it wasn't exactly an overnight process, was it? It took a good solid year, really, of work to get to the point even where we could stand at NASDAQ and ring the bell, right?
Yeah, well, and the big trick we had to deal with was the fact that then, as today, you have to clear a certain hurdle of shareholder approval. And for Greenhill SPAC, it was 80% approval. Now, if you think about it, that SPAC, I think, raised the capital in 2017 or early 2018. The markets crater. If you vote no on the merger transaction, you get your money back, which was probably about the best return that anybody had on an investment in that time frame. And so the overwhelming consensus of the investors in the SPAC was, hey, I'm just going to get my money back. That puts me way ahead of the market. And so we had to figure out a way to get people to vote yes. I mean, Iridium's a great story, and it turned out well. But people have a pretty short time frame, and how do you get that done? Now today, there's a new mechanism that exists with the PIPE that's brought in as a means to fund the acquisition and the transaction and to get it over the line. But what we did at the time, I don't think it had ever been done previously, and I don't know if it had ever been done since, but we actually did a secondary stock offering in the Green Hill SPAC to raise enough capital to buy out the no votes. So we literally had to go out and do a road show. It wasn't like today where, baby, you get on one conference call and do an investor presentation and you're done. It was a full IPO roadshow to go out and bring in all these new investors into the secondary offering and get the transaction over the line, which we did.
Well, I have some memories of that process, as I remember. I mean, beyond having this presentation, remember the people who had invested in the original SPAC were not space investors. They had no idea what would be brought to them for a vote, and they only had 2 years to do it. So we were 6 months from closing. If they didn't close us, there wasn't anything else to close really. So they when we came to them with, hey, we're a satellite company who had been bankrupt at one point. Now we're quite successful, and we have a few risks ahead of us. We have to launch a whole new satellite system. We have to raise debt financing, but don't worry, we're going to cover all that. Most of them said, I don't understand what you're talking about, really. And so we had to go out and convince them. So I remember, I think it was 2.5 weeks we were on the road. Most road shows go a couple days to a week at most point. We had to spend, I think, at least 12 or 13 days all over the US, but in Europe as well. I believe I think I had a flu during the European part. I remember one meeting we had, and the hotel, fortunately, we hadn't checked out of, and I said, I have an hour. And I just basically passed out on the bed, face down, and to try to sleep for about 30 minutes because I was exhausted by the time we were done, just talking about the future of mobile satellite communications and the excitement that I saw and the potential I saw in Iridium with the growing IoT market and the potential for broadband and what the new satellites would accomplish for us and how they would be completed without a hitch, for the amount they were. And I think we turned a lot of heads. We obviously got the number of votes that were necessary, but it was kind of a down to the wire process in those days, particularly because the markets were very, very skeptical of everything, not just us, right?
Oh yeah, and it's worth recalling, again, today we're seeing billions of dollars every year flowing into the space sector, either for these LEO broadband constellations or for startups. But back in that time frame, and I just ran through the numbers the other day, I think between 2005 and 2015, there were an average of maybe 5 to 10 VC-backed space startups a year. Today, it's 5 times that level. And an average of $110 million a year raised. And today it's about $1.4 billion every year if you take out the big LEO broadbands. Those guys obviously raise billions of dollars a pop. So it was not a well-exposed sector. People did not know or own anything spacey in their portfolio. And amongst the companies that had come public, in recent years, Global Star, who was viewed as a primary competitor, had issues with their satellites, with the momentum wheels and with satellites dying. And that raised a whole bunch of questions that you had to beat down again and again about, the fact that, our satellites can last until we get up the next constellation. And of course, you had competitors, a certain one in London, who you were sort of the highlight of their conference call every single quarter, talking about how there was no way you could get funded and no way you could possibly get the constellation on orbit before the old one died.
Yeah, we certainly had a lot of people who weren't rooting for us necessarily to succeed in our space and elsewhere. Plenty of challenges. I often say there were 5 or 6 consecutive miracles required to get to where we are. They weren't really miracles to me or to us because it was just a path forward that we knew that our network was unique. It was powerful. It was capable. It had a track record of success, and we knew if we could just get a new network up there, we could even further the potential of it. Certainly, just another kind of, since we're on the anniversary of that going public, as I remember, I think formulaically we went public like at $10 a share, and I think our market cap was like $500 million or something like that. I mean, it was like 550 million. I feel very proud over 12 years. It's grown a little larger than that. I mean, maybe 10 times that large at this point. And so certainly it wasn't a straight line path through that perspective. There was an awful lot as we built the network where there were still plenty of risks with launches and that sort of thing, but we're in quite a different place than we were then. High cash flow, lots of potential. We don't have to spend money on a system for at least 10 years, any kind of development. So it's a different environment. I'm noting these new SPACs are, and there's a lot of them in the space that have come out. They're coming out public, many of them with no real track record, not a business. I mean, they have a business plan certainly, but they don't have a track record like we did. They don't have, in some cases, even technology, but they're going to have to now be public really I remember the last 12 years. I've now done, I guess it's been 45 or so, quarterly calls where we have to meet and beat expectations. Those companies are all going to have to build those businesses, and I have to, in the public eye. And I have to say, I really feel for them because those CEOs are going to have to meet some impossible targets with absolutely no background or experience to build on. It certainly is a different environment today than it used to be, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I can say that after we did your transaction, I promised to myself I would never do a SPAC transaction again. I can't say I necessarily
never say
fully
never.
held up that promise. Yeah, never say never. Learn that lesson. But it's a different vehicle today, and the markets are in a much different place. And certainly, investors' view of the space sector is very different than it was back then.
Well, I feel we had something to do with that too. I mean, maybe people think that we made it look a little too easy here, and so everybody should be able to do it because of if we can. I keep saying we're a 30-year overnight success story. I mean, you might just suddenly realize who we are, but we're a little bit like that starlet, who suddenly gets the Academy Award, and you didn't realize how she toiled for 30 years before she got there, and that's going to be true of a lot of companies. But there is a lot of opportunity in our sector. I do want to thank you. You had a really important role to play and have a place in our museum. I know your mother is proud of that because I've interacted with her on that. Because you had to put a lot of time and effort in those days in what we're doing. I think anybody watching this video should appreciate that you didn't just fade away in the industry. You've created really an important platform really in our industry, and this is not an advertisement or anything, but I think a lot of people respect you as probably one of the most broad-based, balanced analysts in our industry right now. So I just appreciate that you're involved and in this space and working to continue to tell truth because as I think that commercial is, says something like, we know a few things because we've seen a few things, or whatever that is. It's a little bit like this. We've both been around the block a few times in here and have an idea what works and what doesn't work, right? And I appreciate what you're doing.
I think I used to have brown hair before I started the process with you, and you kind of look like Tom Cruise except with an afro, right?
Well, Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, one of those guys. I don't know which one, but
They get mixed up all the time.
anyway, this is a big milestone for us. It's been 12 years. We're probably going to count them down. If I think about it, we're in our 21st year in this entity, and over 30 years really from an idea concept. It's been certainly a interesting journey that there have been books written about, but there'll probably be more books written about. But it's the people along the way that I will always remember, not necessarily the milestone that occurs, like going public, but the people like you that are involved in it, and the many people who've been involved in the success both inside and outside Iridium. So thank you for your participation. Thank you for having a little remembrance of this occasion on this date, and good luck in the future.
Thanks. It's been a fun ride, and I'm looking forward to what you have in store for us in the future here.
Great. Thanks, Chris.